Get this trainee out of my ICU. We need real doctors, not children playing dress-up. The words, sharp and venomous, sliced through the tense air of the Naval Medical Center's most critical ward. They were delivered by Commander Martin Evans, a man whose prestigious degrees and gleaming service ribbons were outshone only by the sheer magnitude of his arrogance. The crowd, a nervous constellation of residents, interns, and seasoned nurses, flinched. A few offered tight, complicit smiles, the kind meant to curry favor with a superior by endorsing his cruelty. They all turned to look at the target of his scorn, a young woman standing beside the bed of Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a living legend who was now, by all accounts, dying. She was unremarkable in every way. Her uniform, though impeccably clean, seemed a size too large for her slight frame. Her hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun, and her face, devoid of makeup, was a placid mask of concentration. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't even looked up. Her focus remained entirely on the complex web of tubes and wires that tethered the Admiral to the living world, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace as she checked the calibration of a ventilator. But when General Wallace, the Admiral's oldest friend, saw her stance from his lonely vigil in the corner of the room, he saw something else entirely. He didn't see a child. He saw a weapon at rest. If you believe that true competence needs no introduction, type silence below. The silence that followed Commander Evans's outburst was thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic, artificial sigh of the machines that were failing to keep the Admiral alive. Evans, basking in the perceived authority his public reprimand had generated, continued his tirade, his voice a grating lecture designed for the entire room. "This is Fleet Admiral Thorne," he boomed, gesturing with a dismissive wave toward the still figure on the bed. "This man commanded the Fifth Fleet. He is a titan of naval history. His care is not a training exercise for the new girl. It is the single most important task in this hospital, and it requires expertise, experience, and a pedigree that, I assure you, you do not possess." He directed his final words at the nurse, who continued to meticulously document the Admiral's fluid output, her pen scratching softly against the clipboard, an impossibly small sound in the face of such a verbal onslaught. She didn't acknowledge him. It was this lack of reaction, this profound and unnerving calm, that seemed to infuriate Evans more than any retort could have. Her stillness was a mirror, and in it, his blustering rage looked childish and impotent. He saw her as an affront, an uncredentialed nobody who had wandered into his sacred domain. The other staff members shuffled their feet, avoiding eye contact with both the commander and the nurse, caught in the crossfire of a battle they didn't understand. They saw what Evans saw, a new face, a low rank, an assumption of incompetence. They failed to notice the economy of her movements, the way her eyes scanned the full spectrum of monitors in a practiced, unbroken loop, absorbing data far faster than the residents who nervously clustered around the central console. They did not see the minute tightening of her jaw as she observed a subtle arrhythmia that the primary cardiac monitor, set to a lower sensitivity, had failed to flag. They saw a trainee. She saw a battlefield. She was an observer, a silent sentinel cataloging every failing of the system around her, her mind a quiet fortress of process and discipline amidst a rising tide of institutional panic. The very air around her seemed different, cooler, a pocket of professional gravity in a room superheated by ego and fear. She was a ghost at the feast of medical emergency. Her presence barely registered, but her competence an undeniable physical force. The injustice of the moment hung in the sterile air, a palpable contaminant. Commander Evans, having asserted his dominance, turned his attention back to the frantic efforts to stabilize the Admiral. "Push another amp of AP," he commanded, his voice tight with a frustration that was beginning to curdle into desperation. "Let's increase the pressure drip. Why aren't his numbers responding?" The team scrambled to obey, a flurry of motion and hushed, urgent voices. They were following the book, executing the standard protocols for a patient in cardiogenic shock with textbook precision. But the Admiral was not a textbook. He was a warrior, his body a map of old wounds and stubborn resilience, and it was now rejecting their by-the-book solutions with terrifying finality. The nurse, whose name nobody had bothered to learn, placed the clipboard back in its slot with a quiet click. She had seen this before. Not in a hospital, not in a brightly lit ICU surrounded by the finest medical technology in the world, but in the back of a shuddering helicopter, high over a landscape of sand and rock, with the percussive rhythm of rotor wash and distant gunfire for a soundtrack. She recognized the specific, subtle shade of cyanosis creeping into the Admiral's nail beds, a sign not of simple heart failure, but of a catastrophic breakdown in the body's ability to utilize oxygen, a cellular betrayal that no amount of epinephrine could fix. Her silence was not born of intimidation or inexperience. It was the focused quiet of a master craftsman assessing a complex problem. While Evans and his team were fighting the symptoms, she was looking at the source. Her gaze drifted from the monitors to the Admiral's face, to the deep lines etched around his eyes, and finally to a small, almost imperceptible rash spreading on his neck, partially hidden by the collar of his hospital gown. It was a detail lost in the noise, a whisper drowned out by the shouting of the machines. The other medical professionals in the room were a whirlwind of frantic energy, their movements becoming increasingly jerky and inefficient as their efforts proved futile. They bumped into each other, repeated orders, their faces etched with the dawning horror of a high-profile failure. They were a team unraveling, their confidence stripped away with every failing metric on the screen. In the center of this storm, the nurse remained an island of profound calm. Her breathing was even, her posture relaxed but alert. She wasn't just observing the patient. She was observing the entire system, the team, their flawed approach, their rising panic. She understood that their fear was now a clinical factor, as dangerous to the Admiral as the ailment itself. She saw the doctor's pride preventing him from admitting he was lost, his ego demanding he double down on a failing strategy. She saw the residents' fear of speaking up, their deference to a flawed authority. She saw a system designed for predictable crises completely breaking down in the face of an anomaly. And in that breakdown, she saw her opening. Not for glory, not for vindication, but for the one thing that mattered, the mission. The mission, as it had always been for her, was the man on the bed. His rank was irrelevant. His history was irrelevant. All that mattered was the flickering ember of life that the storm of their incompetence was about to extinguish. She took a single, slow breath, centering herself, and prepared to move. The cascade began with a single, piercing shriek from the central monitor. A flat line. The Admiral's heart had stopped. He's coding. Get the crash cart. Charge the paddles to 200. Evans's voice was raw, frayed with adrenaline and the terror of ultimate failure. The room exploded into a controlled, yet chaotic, ballet of emergency medicine. A resident began chest compressions, his face slick with sweat, the rhythmic thudding a grim beat against the alarm's unwavering tone. Another fumbled with the defibrillator paddles, the gel cold and slick in their trembling hands. It was a scene of desperate, heroic effort, and it was utterly, completely wrong. The young nurse moved. She did not run. She did not shout. Her movement was a study in fluid dynamics, a seamless flow of intention and action. She didn't go for the crash cart. Instead, she went to a small, secondary supply cabinet, her hand finding the latch without looking. Her fingers, steady and sure, wrapped around a 14-gauge angiocath and a large syringe. The objects seemed like toys in the face of such a monumental crisis. A senior nurse, seeing her bizarre action, tried to intercept her. "What are you doing? Get out of the way." But the young woman moved past her as if she were a ghost, her eyes locked on a single spot on the Admiral's chest. She had seen the distended jugular vein, the tracheal deviation so subtle it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't his heart that was the primary failure. It was pressure, a tension pneumothorax, likely a rare, spontaneous complication from the central line insertion performed hours earlier. His lung had collapsed, and the trapped air was now crushing his heart, rendering all their efforts useless. They were trying to restart a pump that was being held in a vice. Her preparation was a silent, rhythmic ritual. She ripped open the sterile packaging with her teeth, a feral, efficient motion that was shockingly out of place in the pristine environment. She drew back the plunger on the syringe, her movements economical and devoid of a single wasted gesture. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a diagnosis made not by machine, but by the finely honed senses of a practitioner who had learned their craft in the unforgiving crucible of combat. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds, a lifetime in the suspended reality of a full cardiac arrest. General Wallace, from his corner, watched her, his breath held tight in his chest. He had seen hands like that before. They were the hands of people who dismantled bombs, who performed surgery by flashlight in a ditch, who held the line when the entire world was coming apart. They were hands that belonged to a different tribe, a different species of human, and they were about to perform a miracle or a court-martial offense. The resident doing compressions was tiring, his rhythm faltering. The defibrillator was charged, but Evans hesitated, his eyes darting between the flat line on the monitor and the confounding lack of response. His entire world of algorithms and protocols had failed him, leaving him stranded in a sea of unknowing. And into that void of leadership, the quiet nurse stepped, not with a word, but with the terrifying certainty of a perfectly aimed needle. With the syringe in one hand and the long needle poised in the other, she placed 2 fingers on the Admiral's chest, finding the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with an anatomist's precision. There was no request for permission. There was no time. To ask would be to invite a debate that would cost the Admiral his life. Her authority in that moment was absolute, derived not from rank, but from the simple, undeniable fact that she was right and they were wrong. Dr. Evans finally saw what she was doing. "Stop! What the hell do you think you're?" His voice was cut short by a sound, a soft but distinct hiss, as the trapped air escaped the Admiral's pleural cavity. Released from its prison by the needle, she had plunged deep into his chest. It was the sound of a pressure valve releasing, the sound of a life being given back. Immediately, a jagged, beautiful spike appeared on the EKG. A beat, then another. Sinus rhythm. The flat line was gone, replaced by the steady, life-affirming signature of a heart that was now free to do its work. The team froze. The resident stopped compressions, his hands hovering over the Admiral's chest. The nurse with the defibrillator paddles stared, her mouth agape. The room, which moments before had been a cacophony of alarms and shouts, was plunged into a deafening, absolute silence. In that silence, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic beep of the restored heartbeat. The aftermath was a tableau of pure shock. Every eye was on the young nurse, this anonymous, unassuming woman who had just performed a life-saving invasive procedure with the casual confidence of someone buttering toast. She calmly secured the catheter, attached a one-way valve, and then, and only then, did she look up. But she didn't look at the stunned doctor or the awestruck staff. She leaned down close to the Admiral's ear. He was still unconscious, but a flicker of life had returned to his eyes. She spoke, her voice low and clear, not a medical instruction, but a single, resonant phrase. "Phoenix," she said. "Phoenix, come back to us." It was the Admiral's call sign from his days as a young fighter pilot, a name no one on the current staff would have known, a piece of his soul from a lifetime ago. A single tear traced a path from the corner of the old warrior's eye. His vitals, which had been in a free fall, stabilized completely. The numbers on the screen turned from angry red to calm, reassuring green. The crisis was over. Commander Evans stared, his face a perfect mask of disbelief. That's not possible," he stammered, the words barely a whisper. His arrogance, so monumental just moments before, had been utterly shattered, vaporized by a single, undeniable act of supreme competence. He looked at the nurse, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a trainee, but an enigma, a professional whose skill was so far beyond his own that he couldn't even begin to comprehend it. It was General Wallace who finally broke the spell. He moved from the corner of the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the polished linoleum floor. The authority that radiated from him was of a different kind than Commander Evans's brittle, academic command. It was the quiet, unshakable gravity of a man who had led troops in combat, a man who had seen the very best and worst of humanity. The entire medical team, including Evans, seemed to shrink in his presence. He didn't look at the monitors or the now stable Admiral. His eyes were fixed solely on the nurse. He walked until he was standing directly in front of her, the two of them forming a silent island in the middle of the ICU. "Your name?" "Sergeant," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a command, but one laced with a deep, resonant respect that startled everyone in the room. He had called her Sergeant, not nurse. The young woman finally met his gaze. Her expression was unreadable, her calm unwavering. "Miller, sir. Master Sergeant Kate Miller." The name meant nothing to the hospital staff, but to General Wallace, it was like a key turning in a lock. A flicker of recognition, of profound understanding, crossed his face. He nodded slowly, a deep and ancient memory surfacing. He turned his head and addressed the shell-shocked Commander Evans, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable crackle of command. "Doctor," he began, the word doctor sounding more like an accusation than a title. "You have spent the last hour treating a set of symptoms." This Master Sergeant treated the man. "You were so blinded by the data on your screens that you failed to see the patient right in front of you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the humiliated silence. "You demanded to see a pedigree. You demanded experience. You were standing in the presence of more battlefield medical experience than everyone in this room combined, and you were too arrogant to see it." The general then turned back to Master Sergeant Miller. His gaze softened, but his posture remained ramrod straight. He didn't need to pull up a file. He didn't need to check a database. The file was seared into his memory, a story written in blood and bravery. He knew exactly who she was. The revelation, when it came, was not a quiet word of explanation. It was a formal declaration, a public rewriting of the reality they all thought they knew. He was not merely correcting a subordinate. He was bearing witness to a legend. The entire room held its breath, sensing that the world was about to be turned completely upside down. The general's voice filled the room, each word a carefully placed stone building a monument to the woman standing before him. "Commander Evans, allow me to introduce you to Master Sergeant Kate Miller. Her file is likely classified 6 ways from Sunday, so you won't find it in your standard personnel records. She is not a trainee. She is, in fact, one of the most decorated combat medics of the last 2 decades. She's a pararescueman, a PJ." A collective gasp went through the room. The PJs were ghosts, legends whispered about in barracks and forward operating bases. They were the elite of the elite, the Air Force's special warfare medics who went into the darkest places on Earth to bring people home. "Her official title is nurse," the general continued, his eyes still locked on Miller, because after 20 years of pulling pilots out of downed aircraft and soldiers out of ambushes, she decided she wanted to serve in a place where she could help them heal, not just keep them from dying. "She has more combat saves under direct enemy fire than you have successful surgeries, doctor. She has performed procedures in the back of a burning helicopter that would make your top surgeons faint. She was awarded the Air Force Cross for her actions during Operation Vigilant Talon, where she single-handedly defended a casualty collection point for 6 hours while treating 17 critical patients." He let that sink in. The silence was now one of pure, unadulterated awe. He then delivered the final, most personal blow. "And as for the Admiral's call sign," he said, his voice softening slightly, "she knew it because she was the flight medic on the search and rescue mission that pulled a young Lieutenant Commander Thorne out of the water after his F-14 went down in the Gulf of Sidra 30 years ago. She was a kid then, on her first deployment. He never forgot her, and she, clearly, never forgot him. The connection was made. The mystery was solved. This wasn't a random act of medical brilliance. It was a legacy, a debt being repaid across decades of service. The general then did something that no one in that hospital had ever seen. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together with a sharp click, and raised his hand to his brow in a slow, perfect, formal salute. It was the salute of a 4-star general to an NCO, a gesture of respect so profound it completely shattered the hospital's rigid hierarchy. "Master Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "on behalf of the United States Armed Forces and on behalf of your patient, thank you. Your duty here is done. Take a break, Master Sergeant Miller held his gaze for a long moment, and then, for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. She gave the slightest of nods, a simple, profound acknowledgement. Then, she raised her own hand and returned the salute with the same crisp, practiced precision. In that single, silent exchange, respect was restored, assumptions were demolished, and a new order was established, one based not on rank or title, but on the undeniable authority of quiet, demonstrated competence. The story of what happened in ICU, one spread through the Naval Medical Center not like wildfire, but like a seismic shockwave. It traveled through hushed conversations in the cafeteria, in encrypted messages between department heads, and in late-night phone calls between stunned colleagues. It became an instant piece of institutional folklore, a cautionary tale and an inspirational epic rolled into one. The narrative took on a life of its own, embellished with each telling. They called it the Phoenix, save interns whispered about the angel of the ICU, the quiet nurse who could diagnose a man's soul as easily as his symptoms. Surgeons, men and women with egos as sharp as their scalpels, spoke of her with a new, reverent tone. She had reminded them all that the heart of medicine was not in the procedure, but in the practitioner, not in the technology, but in the wisdom to know when to use it and when to trust your own hands. The transformation of Commander Martin Evans was the most visible ripple effect. The day after the incident, he did not hide in his office or lash out in defensive anger. He was seen waiting outside the ICU nurse's station, holding a simple cup of black coffee. When Master Sergeant Miller began her shift, he approached her not with the swagger of a superior, but with the humbled posture of a student. He offered her the coffee. "Master Sergeant," he began, his voice quiet and stripped of all its former arrogance, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I have no words to adequately express my professional and personal shame. My actions were inexcusable. I made an assumption based on ignorance and ego, and I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. You saved that man's life when I was failing him. What you did, it was the finest piece of medical work I have ever witnessed." Miller simply took the coffee and nodded, her silence giving him the space to continue. "I would be honored," Evans said, his voice cracking slightly, "if you would agree to lead a series of training sessions for my entire critical care staff. I want you to teach us. Teach us what you know. Teach us how to see." Her response was as simple and profound as her actions had been the day before. "I'll clear my schedule," she said. It was an acceptance, not just of his apology, but of a new role. She was no longer just a nurse in the ward. She was its conscience, its new standard bearer. Her quiet competence was no longer a personal attribute. It had become an institutional goal. The legend was beginning to build its own legacy. One conversation, one humble doctor, one inspired trainee at a time. The weeks that followed saw a quiet revolution within the hospital's culture. Master Sergeant Miller, true to her word, began her training sessions. They were not lectures. She did not use PowerPoint presentations or complex academic jargon. Instead, she brought the residents and nurses to the bedside. She taught them to listen, not just to the patient's words, but to the silent language of the body. She taught them to place a hand on a patient's arm, to look them in the eye, to see the human being lost beneath the tangle of medical equipment. Her lessons were parables of quiet observation. She would point out the subtle tremor in a patient's hand that indicated a medication imbalance long before the blood work came back. She would identify the faint scent of acetone on a diabetic patient's breath, signaling an impending crisis. She was teaching them the art of medicine, the part that had been eroded by an over-reliance on machines and protocols. She mentored the younger nurses with a patient but firm hand, reinforcing her core philosophy. Don't just do your job. Understand your job, and understand the person you're doing it for. Her humility was as profound as her skill. She deflected all praise, always redirecting the conversation back to the team, to the process, to the patient. When a local military newspaper wanted to do a feature story on her, she politely declined, stating simply, "I'm not the story. Admiral Thorne's recovery is the story," and recover he did. A week after the incident, Admiral Thorne was sitting up in bed, his voice weak but clear. His first official request was not for a meal or a visit from a dignitary. He asked to see Master Sergeant Miller. When she entered his room, he dismissed his other attendants. For a long time, the old warrior and the quiet medic simply looked at each other, a universe of shared experience passing between them in the silence. 30 years, Kate, he finally rasped. I never got to thank you properly. You did, sir, she replied softly. You got back in the cockpit. That was thanks enough, he smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his stern features. I've made a request to the hospital command, he said. They're installing a small plaque outside ICU 1. A permanent reminder. A few days later, it appeared. It was a small, unassuming piece of polished brass, easily overlooked by the casual passerby. But its inscription carried the weight of the entire event. It did not list the Admiral's name or rank. It read simply, the Phoenix Line, in honor of Master Sergeant Kate Miller, P.J. Competence is quiet. Respect is earned. The line had become a place, a concept, a standard. It was a symbolic artifact, a permanent testament to the day that a quiet professional reminded an entire institution that true authority comes not from the rank on one's collar, but from the skill in one's hands and the courage in one's heart. Months later, the ICU was a different place. The frantic, nervous energy had been replaced by a palpable sense of calm, a quiet confidence that permeated every action. The change was most evident in Dr. Evans. He spoke less and listened more. He solicited opinions from the entire team, from the most junior corpsman to the most senior nurse, treating their input with a newfound respect. He had learned the most important lesson of his career from Master Sergeant Miller, that a leader's greatest strength is not in having all the answers, but in being able to recognize the right answer when it comes from an unexpected source. The culture of the ward had fundamentally shifted from a rigid hierarchy to a collaborative ecosystem, one that valued experience and observation as highly as academic credentials. Miller's training sessions had become a mandatory part of the onboarding process for all new critical care staff. Her philosophy of see the patient, not the chart, was now the unofficial motto of the department. The story of the Phoenix Save had become institutional scripture. New interns were told the tale on their first day, not as a piece of gossip, but as a core lesson in humility and professionalism. It was a reminder that assumptions are the enemy of good medicine, that the person you are most likely to underestimate may be the one you need the most when the alarms start to sound. The plaque, the Phoenix Line, served as a constant, silent teacher. Staff would often pause before starting a difficult shift, touching the cool brass as if to draw strength from it. It was a physical anchor for a new philosophy, a reminder that their work was not just a series of technical tasks, but a profound human responsibility. The legacy of that day was not in the single life saved, but in the countless lives that would be saved in the future by a team that had been fundamentally changed for the better. It was a legacy of quiet competence, a legacy of humility, a legacy that rippled outwards, touching every corner of the hospital and beyond. Master Sergeant Miller, of course, remained unchanged. She continued her work with the same silent dedication, her focus always on the next patient, the next challenge. She never spoke of that day unless asked, and even then, her answers were brief and technical. She had no need for accolades or recognition. Her reward was in the work itself, in the steady rhythm of a restored heartbeat, in the quiet gratitude of a patient's eyes. She was a living embodiment of the principle that true professionals do not need their ego fed. They're sustained by the integrity of their craft. The full impact of Master Sergeant Miller's actions crystallized a year later during a mass casualty drill, a hospital-wide simulation of a catastrophic event. In previous years, the drill had been a chaotic affair, marked by communication breakdowns and jurisdictional squabbles between departments. This time it was different. As simulated casualties flooded the emergency room, a sense of calm, practiced order prevailed. The team from the ICU, led by a transformed Dr. Evans, operated like a single, cohesive organism. They communicated in low, clear tones. They moved with an economy of motion that bordered on art. They triaged, stabilized, and treated with a level of efficiency the exercise evaluators had never before witnessed. At the center of it all, coordinating the flow of the most critical patients, was Master Sergeant Miller, a quiet nexus of control in the heart of the simulated storm. The evaluator's final report was glowing, citing the hospital's critical care response as the new gold standard for the entire naval medical system. The final paragraph of the report was dedicated to a culture they described as the Phoenix Protocol, a new model of collaborative, competence-based emergency medicine. The name had stuck. The legend had become policy. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a file or on a plaque. It's what continues forward in the actions of others. It's the standard you set that others then strive to meet. Master Sergeant Miller's legacy was not just in the Admiral she saved, but in the hundreds of doctors and nurses she inspired, in the thousands of future patients who would benefit from the culture of quiet competence she had forged in a moment of crisis. Her story served as a powerful, enduring reminder that greatness is not loud. It does not boast. It does not demand respect. It simply is. It is the steady hand in the chaos, the calm voice in the storm, the clear eye that sees the truth when everyone else is blinded by panic. It is the quiet professional who proves their worth not with words, but with deeds, earning a level of respect that the arrogant can only ever dream of demanding. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent dedication defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.